Hey, everybody, this is Robert Kinsler.
And this is TJR.
And TJ, with 1973, 50 years in the rearview mirror, I thought we could look back and recap some of the most significant releases of that year. So, in this video, everyone, TJ and I are going to discuss a wide range of releases that came out that year. And we're each going to highlight our three favorite albums of the year. But we thought we'd kick it off and first revisit and go through that kind of long parade of great releases. Let's
Yeah.
start with, yeah, let's start with some of the high profile post Beatles releases from John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Paul McCartney and Wings released the commercial home run Band on the Run, which of course featured Jet and the enduring title track. Ringo Starr released the super successful Ringo, which featured the hit single Photograph. John Lennon released Mind Games, which spawned its own lead single title track that everyone knows. And George Harrison released Living in the Material World, and that's best known for the single Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth.
Wow. All four Beatles with solo releases that year. That must have been hard to keep up with. Not to mention, speaking of greats from the 60s, now in the 1970s, the Rolling Stones released their 11th British album. We'll make that distinction. Goat's Head Soup, best known for the singles Angie, and most people call it Heartbreaker, but it's actually on the album listed as Do 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 Do.
Better sing it.
Yeah, better to call it Heartbreaker, I think. And yeah, not to confuse it with that song by the Police, Da Do 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 Da 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 Da. But yeah, better known as Heartbreaker. An album I've always really liked. I know you've always really liked. Some critics really hate it. Maybe we'll talk about that album in a future video. But yeah, and also getting back to 60s artists, still making it big in the 70s. The Kinks, let me say that a little better, released their concept album, Preservation Act 1, and The Who released their second concept album, Quadrophenia.
And also in 1973, Elton John released not one, but two albums. His cleverly titled Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player. That was in January of 73, only to be followed up by what is to be considered one of his biggest albums ever, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which came out in October of that same year.
Amazing. It's
It
absolutely
is.
amazing. Also in 1973, ZZ Top released their third album, Tres Hombres. This was a real breakthrough album for them. As to why, all I can say is LaGrange. How. There you go.
Yeah,
All right.
1973 is really a bittersweet year, for fans of these next two artists we're going to discuss. Jim Croce released Life and Times in July of 1973. This was an album best known for the track Bad Bad Leroy Brown. Life and Times would sadly be Jim Croce's final album released during his lifetime before he tragically died in a plane crash in September of that same year.
And in spite of that, there was also, even after that, we should mention, there was a posthumous release that same year entitled I Got a Name, which was on December 1st, 73. And this album is best known for the track I'll Have to Say I Love You in a Song.
And speaking about tragic losses that year, Graham Parsons released his seminal solo debut, GP, in January 1973. And, TJ, it's crazy to think that he would die one day before Jim Croce on September 19th of 1973.
On a more positive note, Grand Funk Railroad released the Todd Rundgren produced We're an American Band. And 73 would be a very busy year for Todd Rundgren, as he would produce the debut albums by a very influential band, the New York Dolls. Along that same vein, David Bowie would find life after Ziggy Stardust with Aladdin Sane.
Wow. And going on, three bands who would become rock icons got their starts in 1973. Queen and Aerosmith each released their self-titled debuts, and Lynyrd Skynyrd emerged with pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. That's the name of the album there. I'm guessing their management was worried how their name might be pronounced as Leonard Skynyrd. Uh,
Yeah, well, at that early stage of the career, I can kind of understand that.
hey, we all know it now, but we didn't all know it then, right?
Not necessarily, not necessarily.
And
Wow.
also releasing their debut album that same year was a little known artist named Bruce Springsteen. Maybe you've heard of him. And he
Yes.
released Greetings from Ashbury Park.
Wow. Hard to believe that was their start. Wow. Um, Led Zeppelin, one of the biggest bands of the 70s, released its fifth studio album, Houses of the Holy, which included, of course, seminal tracks like The Song Remains the Same, Over the Hills and Far Away, The Ocean. And I mean, really, the whole album, seminal, every single track, solid. Also, in the realm of heavy rock, Black Sabbath released one of my favorites by them, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And we also saw the debut release of a little then known metal band called Judas Priest and an album titled Rock-a-Rolla.
And then in the genre of country rock and Americana, we had the Eagles Soared with Desperado featuring the enduring title track and also the hit that we all know, Tequila Sunrise.
In that same vein, the Allman Brothers Band released the classic Brothers and Sisters. This would be the band's fourth album, released in the wake of the death of group leader Duane Allman in 1971 and Barry Oakley. And in spite of that, this album did extremely well and was also very notable for its very strong musical performance. In the realm of progressive rock, Genesis also released their fifth album, the groundbreaking Selling England by the Pound, while Yes released their sixth studio album, Tales from the Topographic Ocean.
You know, and going on, soul music was at its most progressive with releases from Earth, Wind, and Fire, who released Head to the Sky, and Marvin Gaye released the seminal Let's Get It On, and Stevie Wonder released his classic Inner Vision. So what a year for soul music, huh?
Yeah, yes.
Really not as well known, but notable were Electric Light Orchestra's ELO 2, the sophomore album from Styx titled Styx 2. And although it's not one of their better known albums, it did feature the band's early hit Lady. And the Raspberries released their Rockin' Third album titled Side 3. And Thin Lizzy also released their third album called Vagabonds of the Western World. And Linda Ronstadt emerged with a growing audience thanks to her album Don't Cry Now.
Quite a list. And we're going to finish this list and mention the godfather of all concept albums and one of the longest charting albums in music history and an album that is considered influential even to this day, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Quite a list for 1973.
Blows your mind, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I know it does boggle my mind.
I'm sure we're missing some, but man, this list is, I mean, you think about it. How did you keep up with all the great music that year? Wow.
I know. How did Elton John manage to release two albums the same year? Yeah, so much happening. So at this point now, we're each gonna just highlight our three favorite albums from this list. And so I'm going to just start with the last album we mentioned, one that I'm sure is on a lot of people's list out there who are watching, and that's going to be Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Now, I actually did make a separate video earlier this year where I gave some thoughts on this album at 50 years of age. But for the sake of this video, and for those of you who may have missed it, to briefly reiterate, I refer to Dark Side of the Moon as the 2001: A Space Odyssey of rock albums. And the reason I say this is because it takes me on a life-changing journey that makes me ponder the nature of my place in the universe. Since I talked about it in a previous video, I'll just leave a link if you want to know the rest of what I have to say. My next album would be Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy. There honestly isn't a bad album in Led Zeppelin's studio discography. And I look at Houses of the Holy as a middle album of three albums that has the band at their peak. And those three albums are Led Zeppelin 4, Houses of the Holy, and Physical Graffiti. We should talk about the other two albums someday, but Houses of the Holy, it features epic musical odysseys. There's The Song Remains the Same, the Rain Song, Over the Hills and Far Away, and No Quarter. All of these songs are just epic, cinematic. There's also the Get Down, James Brown-esque funk of the grunge, the very hypnotic dancing days, the reggae romp of Dear Maker, and the proto metal of The Ocean. Finally, on my list of top 3 albums for that year is Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. And now, not to diss on the previous album that year, Don't Shoot Me, I'm only the piano player. That was a really good album, had some good hits for him, but that album, I think, really set the stage, so to speak. But Goodbye Yellow Brick Road brought down the curtain and cemented Elton John's superstar status during the 1970s. I mean, he was a hit maker, he was big, but that's when he suddenly became probably one of the biggest stars of the 70s as far as music was concerned, was with that album. And this album features the epic instrumental Funeral for a Friend that leads into Love Lies Bleeding. It features some of his biggest hits ever, including signature tracks like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Benny and the Jets, Candle in the Wind, and Saturday Night's All Right with Fighting.
TJ, those are all amazing choices, and yeah, and I agree that because you were just talking about it, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. What a phenomenal album that is. I mean, Love Lies Bleeding, and which comes out from Funeral for a Friend. I had never heard anything like that when I heard it, and I just fell in love with that album at the time, and I was very young, but yeah, great album, and I'm glad to see it on your list. And the other two were great, solid, choices that these are classic albums that endure and I think reach new generations too as well.
So, what are your 3?
So yeah, without further ado, we'll get in to my 3. I'm actually going to kick off with an album that when it came out, I purchased it on vinyl. It was one of the first albums I ever purchased. Just fell in love with it, and that's Ringo Starr's album Ringo. And now this album features guest appearances from a number of great musicians that everyone out there will know, namely John, Paul, and George, who also composed material for the album. So it was kind of like not a bona fide Beatles reunion, but all the Beatles were front and center on that album. There was also a slew of other top tier players: Billy Preston, Klaus Vormann, Nicky Hopkins, Harry Nilsson, Mark Bolan, members of the band, and Jim Keltner, who's a well-known studio drummer, and Ringo often talks about Jim as one of his favorite drummers. They all appeared on that album. What's more, the track listing is terrific. You have Photograph, which was penned by George Harrison and Ringo Starr, Ringo's version of You're 16, and the Rockin' Devil Woman, which is a song I've always really liked. It's also important to remember that both Photograph and You're 16 were #1 hits here in the U.S. And then the album also included the hit Oh My My. And then moving on is we talked a little bit about it earlier, and that would be Graham Parsons' GP. Now, this is an album that received plenty of critical acclaim upon its release, but it failed to chart on the Billboard charts or anything like that. The forces that ultimately gave rise to this masterpiece are far too many to note here, including Graham's ongoing drug problems and him being fired from the Flying Burrito Brothers. But one of the key elements of the success of this album is his discovery of an unknown singer named Emmylou Harris, who was at that time based in Washington, D.C., and she was recommended by Chris Hillman, who had been Graham's bandmate in the Flying Burrito Brothers. And it was her talents, along with the studio band, which was basically comprised of Elvis Presley's band, including James Burton on guitar. This is just a really magical album because it kind of combines the kind of country music you associate with the Bakersfield sound, meaning Merle Haggard and Buck Owens, with mainstream country, maybe what you would think of like Glenn Campbell, and also R&B. And for people out there, and many people that don't know who Graham Parsons is, listen to the duet he does with Emmylou Harris titled "We'll Sweep Out the Ashes in the Morning," and also his song "She." These are just some really amazing songs, and you'll realize how special I think Graham Parsons is when you get to listen to those tracks.
Certainly.
And then the last album I'm going to talk about, going back to the Fab Four here, is Paul McCartney and Wings' Band on the Run. Now, this, after 50 years later, this remains the best known and most beloved and probably most critically acclaimed of all of Paul McCartney's post-Beatles releases. And, I would say for good reason. There was a lot of challenges that went into this album. then Wings drummer Denny Selwell and also guitarist Henry McCulloch had just left the band. So what happened is the band made the decision to go to Nigeria, and that ultimately proved a pretty difficult place to do the album. And Paul ended up doing, bass, all the lead guitar work. I mean, he did a lot. Kerry did a lot of the heavy lifting, but I guess despite all these challenges, I think the McCartneys were even robbed at knife point while they were in Africa. They just delivered this incredible album, and I think, there's just so many great songs on it, and I know we mentioned Bound on the Run and Jet, but also Bluebird is just a really gorgeous song. And I also Let Me Roll It. That's this great blues rocker. And I think that, it remains a great album.
It is. And you're right. It is probably his most celebrated. It's his most universally liked. If I was to say personal favorites, it would be Venus and Mars. But that's just, I think it's just because that was the first album I bought by him when I was a teenager. And that's probably why I have this connection to it. Band on the Run, though, if I just look at it objectively, it probably is a better album than Venus and Mars, objectively speaking.
Yeah. They're both, and I'm with you. I think they're both fantastic albums. But since we're focusing in on 73, I had to put Band on the Run. But Venus and Mars is a good album as well.
Yeah. For 73, yeah. Like I said, just phenomenal album. And I think it's really the album where critics had been really bashing on McCartney for some of his earlier stuff, like his first release, McCartney, Ram. They were really, there was he was kind of quite the punching bag at that point, as far as the critics were concerned.
I think he turned it around here.
Oh yeah. This is definitely where he turned it around as far as the critics were concerned. Yeah, but great, all great albums. And so with that said, we tried to cover as much as we could. And as we talked about this video leading up to shooting this, we were back and forth remembering, both of us saying, hey, we forgot about this album. What about this album? Putting more on the list there. I'm sure there's some really great stuff we missed. Please let us know in the comments. Please tell us your top 3 in the comments as well, because we'll really enjoy being able to read what your top 3 were. And as always, if you like these videos, be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video. And a big thank you to the patron supporters who are helping us to make more videos. Patrons do receive exclusive weekly videos not available on this channel. And mostly, though, just thank you for hanging out and talking music with us. We always really appreciate it. And Robert, this was fun. We'll have to do one for next year as well.
We'll definitely have to. It's a lot of fun, and it's great to rediscover and rethink about these albums in the context of, they're these great albums you love and everyone would agree, but then you put it in that perspective. Hey, this was 50 years ago. I mean, that's crazy to think about.
It is mind-boggling to consider. And by the way, we did a previous episode on this show. These albums are 40 years old, where we discussed the releases of 1983. If you haven't seen that video, we will leave you a link. And next year, which is going to be honest before we know, we're going to have to talk about the albums of 1984 and 1974.
Yeah, we'll have to do that
as well. Absolutely. Well, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and we appreciate you coming by, and we'll see you all in the next video. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.